What is the role of religion in our ever-changing world? From the NewsChannel 5 network, this is Issues of Faith.
Hello everyone, welcome to Issues of Faith. The question we're asking, what killed American public discourse? That is the question in a new report that examines civility and evangelicals. We're happy to have with us the Executive Director of Lifeway Research, Scott McConnell. Thank you for being here.
Glad to be here.
You did the research on this, and this was published, it was put out by the Southern Baptist Convention's Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, correct? And so let's talk about this. I mean, where are we with discourse, civility in our discourse right now?
I think the reason for the entire research project is we've been noticing that really on a daily basis, we're seeing examples of a lack of civility in our conversations, especially our conversations about societal issues and politics. And so this particular research zoomed in on one group in the United States, Evangelicals, a group that, you know, based on their teachings, should be a very civil group. And so we look to see to what extent there's civility among this population, and really to give them pause to think about it, but also to really give anybody who reads the questions a chance to really ponder and say, am I demonstrating civility in my conversations?
So you zoom in on this group, and what did you find?
We actually found that a small group of people can kind of spoil the entire conversation. So on any of our measures of civility, and those measures were things like, do you believe that civil discourse is even productive? Do you believe, do you have a kind of a what about response? So when somebody attacks your way of thinking, do you say, well, what about these things you've done? That's very easy for us to kind of respond in that way, but that really escalates the conversation to a worse place. Do you think attacks on the other side are justified? Do you think that bending the truth is okay when it's your side doing it? Those kinds of responses are kind of the measures of uncivil behavior. Any one of them you'd say, well, that's getting kind of picky, but you start putting them together, building a score out of it, and you kind of have a picture of what uncivil behavior looks like. And among evangelicals, we see that anywhere from 1 out of 7 to a third, the highest number was on that what about question, are admitting that, you know, that's my natural response. I am going there. And another example would be always trying to win the argument. And when you're trying to win the argument rather than, it's really hard to listen to the other person.
And nowadays, I almost feel like these arguments you can't win, because half our arguments are taking place on Facebook or Twitter or something like that, and we're so divided. And someone posts something about one thing, and then a lot of it is, well, what about this? And we're not even discussing the issue we started out with in the first place. We're just yelling at each other.
It's not an exchange of factual views. It really is oftentimes more personal attacks, and really in a disrespectful way.
And that is not, so it's fascinating to me that this was commissioned by evangelicals. So you're asking evangelicals. Of course, it applies to everybody. But I guess, when did this start happening? Do you have a sense of why are we at this place now, and maybe we weren't back in the good old days, if there were good old days? I mean, why are we at this place now?
We don't have another measurement that we can just compare surveys to say, oh, it was in this year that it happened, or those types of metrics. But at the same time, we just see that it's continuing to escalate, and you know, some of it can come out of fear. We see that a majority of evangelicals actually believe that if the other side politically, whoever that is, were able to implement their agenda, that our democracy would be in danger. Well, that's a very fear-filled kind of perspective, and it makes you overreact in some of those short-term interim conversations that really should just be an exchange of ideas and a debate kind of time. We're jumping to, oh, these are really high stakes, and for an evangelical, that really is counter to the biblical narrative, where Peter said, fear God and honor the king. You know, you shouldn't be fearing somebody else's ideology. You should be fearing God. And so it really does, there's a disconnect that we begin to see between what evangelicals, and again, it's a minority of them, but still, it's a number of them, are doing compared to the teachings in the Bible. Just this week I was reading in Luke chapter 6, and we see Jesus giving very different wording than what we're talking about with this incivility, because he's saying love your enemies. He's saying don't judge, don't condemn, forgive. Those are almost the exact opposite of this incivility that we see in behavior.
Jesus would be mortified to look at Facebook half the time.
Absolutely.
And that's not, and in the report it says civility is the canary in the coal mine. Meaning it's this, if it dies, there's a major warning here. And I guess, what is the warning? Why is it a canary in the coal mine?
Really, there's a logical disconnect. So this is not just an evangelical problem because there's a disconnect with the Bible. There's a disconnect with logic when it comes to our democracy. Because both parties are saying we have the ideal view of the future. And that's what we're trying to implement. And yet what we do every day to try to get there is to put each other down and to create a bigger distance from each other. Well, logically, we're actually making society worse today, because that's what we hear about in our conversations with each other. That's what we hear about on social media. That's what the news is highlighting, because that's what happened today. And so it makes today worse, and it makes it harder for us ever to get to that future, regardless of which party, because in a democracy, you actually have to compromise. You actually have to get along to make progress. And so the lack of civility in our society today really is signaling the fact that we're not going to accomplish either of the two parties' views of the ideal future, because that has to be done together.
So you look at our leadership, and there's not a lot of civility in Congress. There's not a lot of civility on Twitter from the President of the United States. And is that, are they reflecting us as a culture, or are they impacting us as a culture? I guess, which comes first, us, and then we create them and they're not civil, or are they making us less civil?
I think in a democracy it's a both and, because we elect our leaders. So we're going to put people in power that reflect who we are, but at the same time as they lead, they're also modeling for us. And, honestly, as individuals, we have an opportunity to model something different. We can model polite dialogue. We can model civil behavior in our interactions with others, and we can break the current mold.
But what if you are somebody who does feel like if the other side wins, or the other side's policies are enacted, it is detrimental to our democracy, or to what I firmly believe? How do you work through that? These are things that people hold passionately, and so how do you work through that?
You've got to remember kind of the what and the how. So we can have different views on how we're going to solve problems, how we're going to get things done as a nation, but we also have to say we're going to accomplish those whats in a way that I'm showing respect and I'm showing dignity to others. We see some direct statistical correlations to people who say, I believe every human being has dignity and deserves respect. They have higher civility scores. They're acting in a way that is more respectful on a daily basis and in their dialogue with others, simply by having that mindset that says, I'm going to respect you even if I absolutely disagree with your view.
And the notion, what were some of the questions you asked, and what kind of stood out? There was one you put out at the top, and I can't remember what it was now, but what are some of the questions you asked that stood out to you most? Is civility even important? I think that was one you put out there. It seems like that's a no-brainer. Everybody would say yes, but you're saying there's a percentage that thought no.
Yeah, about 1 out of 5 evangelicals say it's just not productive. They're not saying that maybe they've heard at several places that they should be respectful to others. They just say that's not a way to win. And I think in our culture today, winning, we put a lot of emphasis on that. And that old adage of it's not whether you win or lose, but how you play the game seems to almost be lost. And yet that how we engage with each other politically is as important as the vote this week or a decision that's made this week.
It can't, keeping score is really dangerous, especially in our individual arguments, because this notion of I have to win this argument, again, I keep going back to Facebook. I don't know how you do that on Facebook when and so it gets worse and worse and worse and more personal and more personal and more personal, and that's kind of what we've seen over the last few years.
It's a topic that requires some courage, but also some discretion. So people who are not willing to speak up when they know that their ideas are not popular politically, that actually corresponds with somebody who's less civil. So not having the courage to jump in is problematic. But then on the other extreme, people who are frequently engaging in political topics on social media also tend to be uncivil. So you can be involved too much and not showing wisdom there, or you can not be having courage to step into the conversation. And what we need for civility in our nation is people willing to engage in the conversation, but showing wisdom and discretion in doing so and showing respect toward each other.
What brought this about? Was there something that brought this about, a specific incident or a series of incidents? What brought us this study about?
I think several people, Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, the Fetzer Institute, both were noticing a lack of civility in the public discourse today, and really desiring to be stepping back into that space. And the reason evangelicals were surveyed was to ask them to look in the mirror a bit, and to say, is my behavior lining up with biblical principles, since that's what evangelicals say matters in their faith. And while 8 out of 10 say they're looking at what the Bible says, only actually less than 4 out of 10 say they've actually changed their political views because of things that they found in the Bible. So it's actually not being applied as much as it needs to be. And I think some of the expressions of evangelicals' beliefs would look different in the public space if they looked at how Jesus instructed interacting with others.
There is this, as Christians are called to go out into the world and proclaim the good news. And so they feel this requirement and duty to do that. In this world, there's so many avenues now. It used to be, I guess you could do that in a face-to-face conversation. And maybe it's not so threatening or overbearing or whatever. But now our ways of communication have changed so much that we have to be very careful when we start doing those things. Is that right? Or what would you say?
Absolutely. I mean, we see even in the data that those who get their news simply through online, that they tend to be less civil than those who are reading and actually spending more time thinking through more thoughtful pieces about what's going on in our society today. So instead of very reactionary, which is kind of what Twitter or Facebook can promote, really just pausing and thinking more. One of the other big things is making sure you listen to people who have differing views than you. We see statistical relationships there as well. Making sure you get news from people who may not have the same politics as you actually correlates with higher civility. Following people on social media who have different views than you politically, socially, actually corresponds with having higher civility. So it takes a little intentionality to say, I'm going to break out of my own little circle. And that even includes friendships. People who have friendships with people who have very different income levels and very different religious beliefs have higher levels of civility. So even though you still may believe that your political beliefs, your religious beliefs, your social beliefs are exactly correct, whether or not you're respectful enough to listen to others is really a key part of creating a civil society.
All right, we have to take a break, and then I want to delve more into that. What can we do, and how will this be used? But we'll take a break. Be back right after this.